Labas, čia Vincentas Palubinskas. Ir kaip visad, sveiki sugrįžę į tinklalaidę Lietuva Amerika. Prieš trumpą savaitės pertrauką dar vienas epizodas, kuriame norėjosi pasikalbėti atvirai, nors gal šiek tiek sunkiau neįprastai. Pirmoje dalyje, verbų sekmadienį, su Žygiu susėdome kavinėje prie aušros vartų, pasikalbėti apie tai, kas vyksta Lietuvoje, apie politinės intrigas, bet dar labiau apie moralinę duobę, į kurią panašu grimsta mūsų valdžia. Antroje dalyje pokalbis su Davidu J. buvusiu JAV Valstybės departamento pareigūnu, o dabar Džordžo Bušo instituto vyresniuoju viceprezidentu. Kalbame apie nusivylimą Ameriką, apie tai, ar dar galima ją matyti šviesos pusėje ir ką reikia daryti, kad ryšys tarp sąjungininkų nenutrūktų visam laikui. Kaip visad, pasidalinkit, užsiprenumeruokit ir prašau parašykit komentarą. Mes šnekam, bet norim girdėti ir jūs. Gero klausimo. Taigi, sveiki Žygi, gražus sekmadienis, verbų sekmadienis. Vakar buvote labai užsiėmęs, iš pat ryto buvo Korberio fondo susitikimas Vilniuje. Taip pat atėjot pasveikinti Jaunųjų konservatorių lygą. Bet ir šiaip savaitė pakankamai tokia sudėtinga, ypač tarptautinės politikos prasme. Tai kokie būtų jūsų, sakykime, top 3 ar tie sunkiausi mano prieš šią savaitę? Na, svarbiausia, tave, Vincentai, sveikinu su tarptautiniu sekretorium Jaunųjų konservatorių. Aš tarptautinis sekretorius ir tu, taip sakant, abudu gražiai dirbam ir tikrai miela vakar buvo matyti tokią gausą jaunų žmonių, patriotiškų. Visi jūs sveikinam, kad jūs esate pirmi ir dar nespėjau Facebook'o parašyti, bet aš tikrai tą manau, kad realiai nuo to, kiek jūs būsite aktyvus, kiek jūs to jaunimo sugebėsite pakelt, priklauso ir mūsų rinkimai. Žiūrėk, praeituose rinkimuose jaunimo mažiau dalyvavo, mes buvom antri, jeigu dabar sukelsim bangą prieš tą Palucko nevalystę ir nesugebėjimą koncentruotis į prioritetus, norėjimą būti geru visiems, manau, laimėsim. Tai tikrai kelkitės. O dėl užsienio politikos, tai va ir šiandien podcast'e turėsime ir vieną gerą vokietį, ir vieną gerą amerikietį, kuris apie tas dramas pasakos. Amerikų dramos tęsiasi dėl tarifų, kas mane šiek tiek neramina ir toliau, nors su Kinija karas kaista, bet su Rusija flirtas tęsiasi, susitikimai su Vitkofu, kurie pačiu blogiausiu variantu gali nuvesti iki tam tikrus sandėrius. Trumpas norėjo net iki Velykų, rusai nori iki gegužės 9 dienos, žinai, kas tai yra, ir tai būtų labai bjauru, tai būtų labai neteisinga, tai su visais draugais tos tikrosios gerosios Amerikos bandant išaiškinti, kad būtų didžiausia kvailystė. Vakar beje labai gerai vienas švedas toj Korberio diskusijoje pasakė tą patį, ką pasakė ir mūsų ankstesni kalbėtojai. Tas reverse Kissinger, kurio bando Trumpas pagrįsti savo žaidimą su rusais, ne tik, kad yra tarptautinė politika for dummies, kaip pats išsireiškia, bet ir galimai tai yra rusų užnešta šiukšlė ir amerikiečių galvas. Tai yra viena iš tų hibridinių atakų, kai amerikiečiai tikinti, kad va, tokiu flirtu jie gali kažkokį rezultatą pasiekti. O aš bijau, gali būti atvirkščiai. Nes matai, ką aš atsimenu iš sausio 13, kai vyksta karas kažkur pietuose, dabar prasideda prekybos karas su Kinijais, gali peraukti kokį nori kitokį konfliktą, tada rusam yra atrištos rankos susitvarkyti čianai rytuose. Ir toks dar įgalinimas rusų, žaidimas amerikiečių, netgi gali ekonominių galių atidavimas jiems, ką pamatysi, tas vokiečiai labiausiai bijo, kad amerikiečiai perims Nord Streamą į savo rankas ir jie pardavinės rusų dujas vokiečiams. Tai yra absurdas. Tai su tokiom nesąmonėm turim kovoti ir kovosim toliau. Na, o iš tos gerosios pusės, kas įvyko šią savaitę, tai iš tikrųjų rekordiškai greitai sudaryta vokiečių koalicija. Man paskambino Merco dešinioji ranka, tarptautinis sekretorius Kremeris, su kuriuo susitiksim Valencijų, kur vyks mūsų krikdemo europiečių susitikimas.
tikėtina, kad jisai dirbti aukštai pasmerkšai kanceliariją, galbūt bus jo dešinioji ranka užsienio politikoje, jis pasakė taip. Tu žinai, Žygi, dėl ko mes taip greitai susitarėm? Dėl to, kad matome, kas vyksta Amerikoje. Ta prasme, sąjungininkai, kuriuos rėmės tiek daug laiko, dešimtmečiais pradeda daryti nesąmonės ir netgi žodžiai Trumpo pavartoti, jau necituosiu jų čia, taip sakant, mus tiesiog išeidinėja. Ta prasme, jeigu dėrybas jis vadina atitinkamais veiksmais, tai, žodžiu, vokiečiai konsoliduojasi ir vakar tie paskutiniai žodžiai vokiečių organizatorių, ten buvo tikrai aukščiausi vokiečių generolai, protai, ekspertai, politikai, diplomatai. Mes turime nustebinti, kad šis istorinis momentas turi būti atsimintas tuo, kad nustebtų ne tik rusai, ne tik kiniečiai, ne tik amerikiečiai, bet ir patys europiečiai. Mes turime pakelti savo gynybą, mes turime lyderiauti, atveriant Ukrainai duris į Europos Sąjungą ir NATO, ir aš kažkaip tikiu, kad kas jau kas, bet vokiečiai tai sugebės. Gal tai yra per didelis tikėjimas, bet
aš manau, kad tikrai reikia dėti daug tų vilčių į vokiečius. Visų pirma, prieš grįžtant ir pakalbant apie vokiečius, aš norėčiau paminėti, kaip viskas įvyko šią savaitę. Visų pirma, kai tie muitai amerikonų drastiški buvo paskelbti mums, geriausiams savo draugams, kolegoms, alijanso nariais, ir aišku, reikia pridėti šitą detalę, kad nebuvo paskelbti nei Rusijai, nei Baltarusijai, nei Šiaurės Korėjai, aišku. O jūs matėt, kaip jie suskaičiavo šitos muitus ir kaip juos taikyti? Aš manau, kad tai parodo, teoriškai gal muitai yra, gal strateginis įrankis, bet šiuo atveju, prašau gerbiamieji, kai jie yra taip skaičiuojami, taip nekompetentingai, taip nesąmoningai, tikrai verčia susimastyti, kaip mes turime veikti šitą administraciją. Ir aišku, dėl to pačio Merso labai viliuosi, kad čia nebus tuščios vokiškos kalbos, kaip dažnai būna, bet iš tiesų bus pagaliau tokia lyderiaujanti jėga Europai, ko mums baisiai trūksta. Ir kad ir kas bebūtų, ar tai susitikimai Paryžiuje, ar Londone, bet turiu pasakyti, kad nuo tų susitikimų konkrečių rezultatų kaip ir nėra. Taip yra vadinama coalition of the willing, bet o ką tai reiškia? Kokie rezultatai, kur mes judam?
Ta koalicija visų pirma, aišku, turi užsiauginti savo karinius raumenis. Ir vokiečiai deda pinigus ant stalo, dėja kol kas visos Palucko kalbos lieka kalbom, kai jo paklausi, kur pinigai, jisai atsako labai keistai, nes jisgi faktiškai atsitraukinėja nuo paties savo siūlymų, jau ir cukraus, nekilnojamo turto nuvilnys protestai, Žemaitaičio jo koalicijos partnerio organizuojami, tie pinigėliai, kuriuos jisai bando sukelti per pelno mokestį, jų niekaip neužtenka viskam, neaišku, ar tai yra ir teisingas sprendimas. Manau, teisingiau būtų, kad kiekvienas Lietuvos pilietis, puikiai žinodamas, kad tie pinigai konkrečiai gynybai turėtų susimokėti už savo ateitį, bet kokių sprendimų nėra, ir kai jo paklausia apie gynybą, jam tai yra paskutinis prioritetas. Tai man yra problema, kad nors vokiečiai lyderiaus ir mes tikrai padėtume savo socdemams susikalbėti su tais krikdemais, kurie atėjo į valdžią Vokietijų kartu su socdemais, bet problema, kad pas mus lyderystės nėra. Ir kaip matei, kaip jautriai sureagavo Paluckas, kai aš jo šiandien paklausiau, klausyk vaikinė, jau praėjo pusę metų, kada tu lankysies Vakaruose? Tu ką galvoji, kad tavo ministrai komandiruotėse lankydamasi užvažiuos į Baltuosius rūmus ar susitiks su Mercu ar kitais? Mes su tavim susitiksim su Mercu Valensijoje, krikščionių demokratų susitikime, kur Laurinui tikiuosi tą susitikimą padarys, bet jis net nepakelia savo vienos vietos tam. Jam tai net neįdomu, jisai ginasi, o ten daromi sprendimai, nuo kurio priklausys viskas.
Dar pridėsiu, buvo tas momentas, jau prieš šią savaitę ar praeitą savaitę, kai Vilniaus žmonės ėjo pagerbti žuvusių Amerikos didvyrių Lietuvoje, Pabradėje, kur Paluckas buvo. Nebuvo, nes regionai yra svarbiau neva. Ir aš manau, kad jau šitas ne tai, kad tuščios kalbos, bet šitas pasyvios kalbos iš Palucko, kur akivaizdžiai matosi, kad jis ne visai supranta, kad mums reikia gynybos čia pat, dabar, rytoj, mums jos reikia iš karto. Ir jis akivaizdžiai šitą nesupranta ir jau šiuo momentu, aš žinau, kad jūs šito negalite sakyti, bet šviesiai tiesiai man tai pradeda atrodyti išdavikiška mažų mažiausiai.
Aš pritarsiu tau, nes matai, kas yra išdavikiška, tas priešinimas lietuvių su savo sąjungininkais. Į mano klausimą, aš esu normalu, aš esu buvęs diplomatas, aš žinau, kad mes turim juodai dirbti su sąjungininkais, kad jie ateitų į protą taip, kaip mes atėjome Šiaurės ir Baltijos šalyse. Jau vokiečiai eina į tą pusę. Jeigu vokiečiai atsibus, rusai čia nebeateis. Bet mums reikia užkrėsti visus kitus, reikia sujungti vokiečių ir Kubiliaus energiją, Briuselio pinigus ir vokiečių energiją. Mums reikia, bent jau sustabdyti Vašingtoną nuo tų nesąmonių, ką jie šiuo metu daro. Ir, logika yra tokia, apie tai kalbės netrukus mūsų podcast'e Krameris. Sprendimai vis tiek priimami Baltuosiuose rūmuose. Į Baltuosius rūmus reikia patekti. O jisai faktiškai supriešina šį tikslą su lietuviais. Palauk, ir tu esi lietuvis, kuris turi giminių Amerikoje. Ten yra mūsų, mes visi europiečiai sukūrėm tą pačią Ameriką. Mes turime bandyti ją sulaikyti nuo kvailysčių, nes po Velykų kalbėsime su tą Polą Dobrenskį, kuri pasirodo, aš vakar jau baigiau skaityti knygą, jos tėvuko. Jinai buvo Reigano dešinioji ranka, jinai buvo pagrindinė Europos direktorė. Ir jinai toj knygoje jos tėvukas aprašo, kaip sunku buvo įtikinti amerikiečius. Gal čia ir užbaigsiu. Įsivaizduok dabar tą Radio Liberty, kurį uždarinėja Trumpas. Iš tikrųjų, jisai pradžioje vadinasi kitaip. Radio Liberation, nes pradžioje amerikiečiai galvojo, kad visi šitie instrumentai ir pats NATO bus skirtas išlaisvinti Lietuvą, padėti mūsų partizanam ir ukrainiečių kovojantiems. Tačiau nugalėjo linija appeasemento, kad geriau apginam patys save, užmirškim ten tos vaikinus, kurie po Jaltos liko Lietuvoje, ir tik Reiganas tą prisiminė. Tai mes negalime apleisti Amerikos iki tokio lygio, kad mūsų užmirštų, ir Palucko tokie kalbėjimai, nepykit, bet mums nepadeda.
Visiškai nepadeda. Darome, ką galim, ir toliau kalbėkime su žmonėmis, bandykime jiems parodyti, kad vis dėlto mes čia esam. Mes kovojame už jų pačių vertybės, už laisvę, už demokratiją, ir stenkimės ne tik dėl mūsų, bet dėl viso mūsų pasaulio. Ir stenkimės dėl tokių jaunų žmonių kaip tu, kuriuos mačiau Vilniaus savivaldybėje, tai yra ir jūsų ateitis. Paluckas turi prisiminti, kad jisai kovoja ir dėl ateities kartų. Jis negali galvoti tik apie savo kėdutę. Dėl to ateikite ir balsuokite už mus kitose rinkimuose. Gerai, Vincent, ačiū labai. Iki sekančio. Iki.
You are famous in Lithuania, but can I just make a little introduction to our, listeners, and maybe you can correct me. First of all, I remember you as the last Mohican of those good Republicans whom I was calling like political director. I think you've been doing Eastern policies in State Department, and my God, if I have David, we agree on the action, and freedom is marching, from Georgia to Ukraine. You were so kind. It was the last moment when I could have officials from State Department on phone, coordinating with me everything. The rest of the story, you had to demarch State Department for them to hear me. So that was the end. And that was before Bucharest, when Bush, the president, whose institute you represent, he was pushing Ukrainian membership in NATO. The last president who did it. Then I remember you in Freedom House, and you were so kind to establish Freedom House office in Vilnius with Vytis Jurkonis is still working. I remember you with McCain. I remember you in Florida, and now you are in Dallas. So, you are everywhere, but you are very well known that like a person who was one of the first to think like us on Russians and what they do in the East. So,
well, Žygas, thank you. But let me just add one element to that. I'm grateful for that very kind introduction. But the Freedom House office was your idea, and it was possible thanks to your tremendous support. It never would have happened. And it was, I think, a genuine, sincere reflection of your personal commitment to the cause of freedom, but your government's commitment and the people of Lithuania, who are among the bravest supporters of freedom in the region and the world, for that matter, because you stand up to the Chinese as well. It isn't just in your region. So it's thanks to you and all of your compatriots for allowing Freedom House to set up an office there and for having such great relations with the United States. So grateful to everything you have done in your illustrious career as well.
Okay, David, let me go deep and provoke immediately, as I always like to do, appeasement of Russia. You know, it is like, I don't know, it's like a disease. I'm always fighting in Washington, D.C. I'm now finishing the read of Lev Dobransky book. And I was shocked to see, my God, this guy was fighting exactly like me. He was trying to push Washington, NATO, then after the Second World War, to engage with freedom fighters in Ukraine, in Lithuania, to liberate us. And he says, well, appeasement won, NATO just deterred Russia, but did more or less nothing, and only Reagan did it. And so I thought, my God, so what's happening with Washington? Is it because you are so far away from us that it takes every administration, every generation to push you to fight for freedom? Is it like permanent disease in Washington? Because now Trump is doing what Obama was doing, you know, it's appeasing Russians, and it's like Sisyphus myth, you know, you have to ride the stone and it's always falling back. Can we fix it, or it's impossible, kind of?
Well, I mean, it is
This is
interesting.
capital of freedom. This is capital who defeated all empires, you know, this is beacon of freedom. Why it is so difficult to get it?
Good question. And I think it's made even more complicated if we remember during President Trump's first term. There was the famous Helsinki summit, of course, that was not the best reflection on the United States, but President Trump was the one who agreed to allow lethal military assistance to go to Ukraine after the Obama administration refused to do so. It was under the Trump administration during the first term that imposed additional sanctions on Russia, that closed some of the consulates that Russia had throughout the United States. So it is interesting to see what is playing out right now with the Trump administration and its approach. I think part of it is there is not the bench within the administration that has experience dealing with Russia is very thin. And instead you have right now, Steve Witkoff seems to be the main point person dealing with Russia. He has really no experience dealing with the Russian side. And I worry that his inexperience dealing with the Russians makes him a little more vulnerable to believing what the Russians are telling him. You compare that to the Russian side, where Yuri Ushakov used to be the Russian ambassador. If you remember, around the same time you were in D.C., I knew Ushakov very well when I was in the State Department. You've got Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister who was in the embassy in Washington. Sergei Lavrov, of course, was the Russian ambassador to the UN. On the Russian side, you have deep and vast knowledge of the United States and knowledge of how to deal with us. You don't have that right now in this current Trump administration. You did with the previous one, where people like Rex Tillerson had a lot of experience dealing with Russia, and I think turned sour toward Russia as Secretary of State. Pompeo, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton. So in the first Trump administration, there were a lot more people who were steeped in dealing with Russia. You don't have that right now in the current one. And I think that may be an issue that the Russians are exploiting.
I mean, what I'm seeing here now and what you've mentioned certainly does tie into this. We certainly have seen a change in the Republican Party from the one that we in Lithuania know and love, the party of Reagan, the party of freedom, the party of a value-based world order, rather than pragmatism and simple exchanges. I mean, we can see that it's gone, or at least it's on pause. Can we even pretend to hope that it will come back?
I think so. Look, I think there is the good chance that Putin and his team will overplay their hand. As it is right now, the Russians are doing everything except agreeing to the 30-day ceasefire that President Trump has attached a lot of importance to. At some point, I would hope and anticipate the White House will realize the problem is not in Kyiv. It never has been. The problem is in Moscow with Putin and all of his advisors who think continuing this war is to their advantage. They're not interested in ending the fighting. They want to continue the fighting. Putin wouldn't even know what to do if he had to bring these hundreds of thousands of soldiers back to Russia. He doesn't care about them. He does worry that they could present some force that could threaten his grip on power. But I do think that there is a chance that the actions on the Russian side will lead Republicans in Washington these days to rethink the approach. I do think within Congress, maybe not so vocally, but more quietly, there is still strong support for Ukraine. And surveys that are conducted in the United States still show strong support among Americans. But the difference between Democrats and independents versus Republicans is quite stark. Support for Ukraine among Republicans has dropped significantly. And I do hope that that can be restored. It is interesting to remember for all of the Republican House members who supported the assistance package last April, around this time last year, for Ukraine, none of them lost a primary race. They all were able to go ahead to the general election. And as far as I know, none of them lost their general election. But I know for a fact, none of them was primaried in the terms of losing their primary race against other Republicans who went after them because of their vote on Ukraine. So it has not been a political price to pay for supporting Ukraine over Russia. And I do hope that there will be greater understanding of the threat that Putin poses. I was uncomfortable, to say the least, with Kirill Dmitriev's visit to Washington last week. He is trying to get business back to normal between Russia and the United States. There are negotiations taking place today in Istanbul between the Russian and American negotiators about trying to normalize the diplomatic relationship and restoring staffing to respective embassies and reopening consulates. I hope that the administration understands that it is not a pretty picture to be talking to Russian officials about returning to doing business in Russia, restoring normal diplomatic relations. At the same time, Russian forces are bombing and killing Ukrainians every single day.
That's very well and true, but I mean, with this attempt to normalize relations to some extent, at least in terms of economics, it's very unsettling for us on especially the eastern flank of NATO, as it were, because the constant demand that we hear from the Russians and what we call the axis of evil is that NATO, the collective NATO, bring or take its troops away from Russian borders. That means taking troops out of Lithuania, out of Latvia, Estonia, etc., etc. I mean, this is terrifying for us because we in Lithuania realize that without NATO, we would have been swallowed by the Russian Empire a long time ago. Again, so what can we, first of all, as Lithuanians, do to ensure that that our position, that our relationship with America is such that the Americans wouldn't even consider to leave us for stranded?
Well, let's start with the fact that Lithuania has been a tremendous contributor to security on the European continent and also a contributor to various NATO missions in other parts of the world. And so Lithuania deserves tremendous credit. A number of Lithuanians have made the ultimate sacrifice in contributing to security around the globe and on the European continent. So I think in that sense, Lithuania has not much more to do. It has demonstrated what a tremendous and loyal ally it is, even if it is a country that has 1% of the U.S. population, essentially. But it has been a tremendous ally, and I think bringing Lithuania as well as Latvia and Estonia into NATO was absolutely the right thing to do. And so I think what Lithuania can do now is to encourage other European members of NATO to convince the United States that maintaining its presence in Europe is absolutely critical to avoid any Russian thinking that it might be able to move against the Baltic states. You are the closest ones to Russia, Finland, of course, too, and Norway has border, Poland has the border with Kaliningrad, but you guys are at the tip of the spear, so to speak, and it is absolutely vital that the U.S. maintain its presence there to act as the deterrent so that Lithuanians can go to sleep every night and not worry about being invaded. And so I think maintaining the presence in the Baltic states, not just the United States, but fellow NATO member states, maintaining the presence in Poland, making sure that SACEUR is an American-filled position at NATO, all of these things are critical to maintain NATO's deterrent effect. NATO will only be as successful as Putin will believe NATO will do something if he were to do something. And so that requires maintaining a strong U.S. presence on the European continent, and that includes helping Ukraine maintain its security and stability.
David, can I then come back to what we started? You know, I'm now speaking like former ambassador in Washington, D.C. Still, explain me why the strongest democracy on this planet with the strongest intelligence apparatus, you know, you have the best spies, you have the best think tanks, the strongest think tanks, so brains are the best, Congress, the strongest on this planet. Why we have this roller coaster on national interest? Because I was in this event with Mitch McConnell, who said Americans are terrible partners because they are so good to stab themselves in the back. Like, why with this, with all those brains, with all that intelligence that is top of the world, Americans are not getting who is enemy and who is friend. Like, I'm taking this Ukrainian case. In all the books, you know, from old, you know, Zbigniew Brzezinski to Lev Dobransky, it's like obvious that it is like in the deepest American national interest to get Ukraine on the Western side, to create Europe whole and free, to push those Muscovites, the last empire back. And still, with each administration, you have to explain it. Is it because of Russians are so deep in DC? You know, because I remember Russian ambassador was in charge of, I don't know, 3,000 spies in DC during my times. Is it because Americans don't take the propaganda, the wartime propaganda seriously that takes American hearts and brains? Why this political roller coaster? Why Americans don't get what is real national interest of this country in our region?
I think there are a couple of explanations, Gigas. I think one is American presidents often come into office thinking they know the secret way of improving relations with Russia, and they try and they fail. And what has been the consistent thread throughout each change in U.S. administrations? Vladimir Putin. Putin is a threat, not only to his own people, not only to Lithuanians, others on the European continent, but to the United States. And until there is a real acceptance and understanding of that, and until American presidents stop coming into office thinking they know the way to fix this problem, we'll keep going through this process of trying and failing. I think there is also this is partly an effect of Russian propaganda that seeps into the United States. You saw this with the Tucker Carlson trips to Moscow last year, the interviews with Putin, with Lavrov and others. He goes to a Russian supermarket and thinks it's wonderful. And so there is, I would say, an unfortunate gullibility on the part of some in the United States to believe this nonsense, to believe that Putin is the upholder of traditional values against the decadent West. And I think the situation with Ukraine is about as black and white as you can get. There are not that many conflicts that are so clear, where Russia is clearly the guilty, aggressive party that invaded Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. Ukraine is the innocent defender of its freedom as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion. By the way, as you both know, going back to 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. This is not new. And so I think it is, there's also an element, and this frustrates me significantly, of exhaustion with this issue, where I think we have absolutely no right to feel exhausted because we're not the ones doing the fighting and dying. It's the Ukrainians who are. If anyone is exhausted, it's the Ukrainians. And nobody wants the war to end sooner than the Ukrainians do. But they want it ended in a way that Russia never does this again, and they can regain not just their territory. And when people talk about, well, Ukraine has to recognize it won't regain all of its territory, there are people who live on this territory. And if we want to consign those millions of Ukrainians to living under brutal Russian repression, we have to be more transparent about that rather than just talking about territory as this ambiguous concept. And so I do think that, yes, you're right. There are a lot of smart people in DC. There are smart people in the administration. But there needs to be greater understanding that this issue, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is not complicated. It is pretty clear what needs to be done, and that is support Ukraine, pressure the Russians, seize these assets that are in the United States and Europe and elsewhere, make Russia pay and hold Russia accountable. It's not much more complicated than that.
Why is it, if I may ask this, that it seems that America is thoroughly enamored with the idea of Russia? I mean, and let me expound on that. Right? It seems that since the end of the Cold War, there has been, time after time, effort after effort put into resetting or normalizing, or at least having some constructive relationship with Russia. But why is that? There are so many better candidates to be friends with and allies with and trading partners within Russia, which, not only on the surface, but any way you look at it, there is very little value in Russia other than oil. Maybe they're the biggest country in the world, right? But they don't have that many people. They don't have a very good economy. Why?
This goes back many years, where there has been a tendency among some in the United States to think that, boy, if Russia and the United States could get along, then the world would be better off overall. You heard this recently in Steve Witkoff's interview with Tucker Carlson, where he was talking about various areas where the United States and Russia, if only they could cooperate, how great that would be. How many decades has that been tried and failed? And so I think part of the problem is we don't learn from our failures and our mistakes. And we need to recognize that the problem is, look, the United States is far from perfect, as we have a tendency to demonstrate a lot. But the United States has tried over the years to improve relations with Russia. Going back to even before the breakup of the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, there were efforts to try this, and it continued under Yeltsin, and then it ran into huge problems, particularly with Putin. And so I think there is this desire, given the size of Russia, given what some perceive to be its enormous potential, but we always run into the same roadblocks. And it isn't just Putin. It is the nature of the Russian regime, which undoubtedly will continue after Putin is gone, at least for a considerable period of time. And as long as there is this revanchist thinking in Russia, then it will remain a threat. And so I do hope that there is greater understanding of that. But it's also important for people in the United States not to fall for Russian propaganda or not to listen to people who repeat Russian propaganda. And I think there's been a little too much of that of late.
And David, what's like, I was like laughing inside when you've been speaking. Those Americans, maybe they don't know how much Russians hate America, but I still know Russian language. I know what they think. Every Russian troll that is attacking me every day, you are like incarnation of devil for them, because it's like you are the best expression of freedom that they never had. And like, they despise you. They are also laugh at your weakness and stupidity and naivete when you go into talks. How many President Putin so naive, like, I don't know. So they simply don't know what each Russian thinks. But okay, here we are to tell the stories about that. Let me ask just maybe last question from my side. In Lithuania, actually, according to some opinion polls, youth like Vincentas, till 30, they are the happiest on this planet. We are optimists. We shine freedom. We know that we can defeat all the devils of this the world. And we want to believe that dream. And I have this dream still, despite all those political troubles, to get Ukraine into EU and NATO. With EU, we are kind of strategically done. It was a huge fight for decades. Now we have Germans, we have von der Leyen, we have Commission. It's a heavy machine, bureaucratic, but I would say 5-6 years, maybe even most romantically 2030, they will be members of EU. What about NATO? Because we know, David, that in our territory, you cannot survive without that shield. Despite all the current problems we have in DC, do you see some possibility to come back to NATO membership, to the call that Bush started in Bucharest and we were all failing with? Because two white Trumpist Republicans on the Hill recently told me, Žygis, well, if you work hard, if Europeans are becoming like Americans, they're building their military muscle, if you go to your defense spending like we want, if you share our responsibility after 2, 3, 4 years, if you come back to DC, maybe we can come back to that question. But maybe it's a wishful thinking. What do you think?
I think in the near term, it's not in the cards. But I think a little longer term, it is, and it should be. And I think part of it is we need to twist the argument around a little bit. Yes, of course, Ukraine would benefit from Article 5 security guarantees. There's no question, and it deserves it. And the reason it deserves it is there is no current member of NATO who has, unfortunately, tragically, the experience Ukraine has in fighting the Russians. There is no country that has demonstrated its courage and heroism in standing up to a much bigger Russian military force. The Ukrainians, I think, would add tremendous value and be a huge net contributor to NATO's security and stability. And I think there needs to be much more recognition of that. Ukraine has contributed to, just as Lithuania has, to operations in Afghanistan, to operations in Iraq. Many Ukrainians also pay the ultimate price in sending their brave men and women into those situations. And of course, every day, particularly since February of 2022, we have seen incredibly courageous, brave Ukrainians standing up to the Russian military. And so Ukraine has demonstrated that it belongs in NATO. I've argued for quite a while, and I think you too, Žygis, that NATO would be lucky to have Ukraine as a member. It isn't that NATO would be doing charity for Ukraine by bringing it in. We would be incredibly fortunate. Think about how much we would widen the stable, safe territory on the European continent by bringing Ukraine into NATO. I mean, one thing Putin has shown, I think, fairly consistently over the years is a fear and respect for NATO. He does not want to test NATO. There was a cyber attack against Estonia in 2007. We didn't respond to it. I think we should have. I was in government at the time. I should have done more then. But I think NATO is in a stronger position today than it was. But, and I'll just add this, it depends on the United States remaining the key NATO member state, and the United States reassuring fellow allies that we will stay in the alliance. You had Matt Whitaker just recently confirmed as the new U.S. ambassador to NATO, pledging that the United States would remain a strong member of the alliance. Marco Rubio said the same thing. I hope those statements are a true reflection of the views in the Oval Office. NATO has to have the United States at its core. And so, as the most successful military alliance in history, we need to understand that it would actually be enhanced through Ukrainian membership. And I hope that is in the cards down the road.
Thank you, David. And last question from Vincentas. You are part of the future that we are now trying to fight for.
Indeed.
Yeah. So last question from me, if you don't mind, looking at things realistically right now and looking on, the nightmare that we're in terms of how our beloved friends from across the Atlantic are, treating their closest allies, right? In terms of rhetoric, but not only in terms of tariffs and so on and so forth. How do we actually make sure that this remains a nightmare of the past and move forward to keep America in the picture, to keep America as that central player in NATO that keeps us all safe, with, of course, Europe working together with it? Because we don't want to lose America. We do love America, and we really hope you guys wake up from this terrible nightmare that you are in right now.
Yeah, look, I agree, Vincentus. I think there will be a realization and a recall of how our closest allies are in Europe, our NATO members. We should change any views that may exist that think the EU is a creation to undermine the United States. It's not. The EU is created in order to try to maintain peace and stability on the European continent. NATO, of course, plays an essential role in that too. And I hope that there will be better understanding that if we want to deal with the challenge posed by China, we will need our European friends and allies on board to do that. Lithuania has demonstrated its courage in standing up to the communist leadership in China in support of Taiwan. And so I do think that over time, there will be greater appreciation for the value that our alliance with Europe has for the United States. I think as you see more people come into the administration, particularly hopefully at the State Department, you'll see greater engagement with Europe and an understanding that transatlantic ties are absolutely essential, not just to Europe's security, but to America's security. And I think there is strong support in the Congress for better relations between Europe and the United States. And I hope that will also have an impact on the thinking of the administration as well. Transatlantic ties are absolutely essential. The only time Article 5 has been invoked, as you know, was when the United States was attacked on September 11th. And so Europe came to our aid and defense in our time of need. And we need to remember that and make sure that we are there should Europe be in a time of need. But the transatlantic relationship, from economic benefits, trade benefits, political benefits, security benefits, there's so much to be gained by maintaining incredibly good, constructive, positive relations between both sides of the Atlantic that I think that will prevail in the end after a bit of a rough patch here.
Thank you, David. And thank you for not only for this podcast, but for decades of your work. Best regards to President Bush, who made the best decision ever after 9/11 to invite Baltics to NATO. We are happy, we are strong, we inspire others. And those Republicans who are listening, keep fighting for people like David Kramer. He is the ideal Republican. He is the image of your party, and you still have a lot of great people. So you have a future Republican Party. Okay.
Jiga, thank you, my friend. It's great to see you. Vincentus, it's great to meet you. And as Jiga said, you are the future not only of your country, but for all of us. So we're looking to you as well.
Well, thank you very much. Very appreciated, and let's stay in touch. It was a pleasure. Ši serija buvo apie daug ką, bet labiausiai apie atsakomybę. Pirmoje dalyje kalbėjome apie jaunųjų konservatorių lygą, apie naują kartą, kuriai teks perimti laisvės fakelą iš tų, kurie jį mums atnešė. Ir kartu apie tai, kaip kai kurie šiandienos politikai, kaip Gintautas Paluckas, šitą atsakomybę išduoda. Ypač kalbant apie tai, kas Lietuvai svarbiausia - gynybą, orumą, išlikimą. Antroje dalyje tikrai nuoširdus pokalbis su Davidu J. Kalbėjome be užuolankų. Apie tai, ką Amerika daro blogai, apie tai, kodėl dešimtmečius nesugeba atsispirti blogio imperijos pagundoms ir apie tai, ką daryti mums, europiečiams, kai didysis sąjungininkas ima dvejoti. Bet net ir kai abejojama, negali nustoti kovot už laisvę ir tiesą. Nes jei mes jų neapginsim, niekas kitas to nepadarys. Tad ačiū, kad buvot su mumis, pasidalinkit, pakomentuokit ir prašau, nepameskit šviesos, net kaip link viskas temsta. Iki sekančio.